What happens when a cartoon crosses the invisible line between playful fantasy and unsettling darkness? Why do some animated classics, once beloved on television, suddenly vanish or return heavily edited? This list uncovers the forgotten shadows behind famous cartoons that censors once feared were too disturbing for young viewers. From haunting imagery to psychological danger, these 12 titles reveal how animation sometimes pushed too far and paid the price. Number 12. The Skeleton Dance, 1929. When Walt Disney released The Skeleton Dance in 1929, audiences had never seen anything quite like it. A silent graveyard, a rising moon, and a group of skeletons joyfully leaping, clattering, stretching, and bending in impossible ways. It was meant to be playful, a surreal marriage of light-hearted animation and spooky nighttime atmosphere. Yet the combination struck an unexpectedly nerve-rattling chord in many regions. Some audiences embraced the short as a technical marvel, praising its fluid movement and experimental spirit. Others reacted with unease. The idea of skeletons dancing on graves felt too close to the macabre, too eerie for children, and too suggestive of themes usually kept out of family entertainment. Complaints poured in from theater owners and parent groups who believed the cartoon's gothic imagery would frighten young viewers instead of entertaining them. The backlash eventually grew strong enough that several distributors rejected the short entirely. Some theaters refused to screen it. Others demanded it be removed from programming blocks that targeted children. In certain regions, unofficial bans lingered for decades as the cartoon gained a reputation as a strange, taboo experiment from Disney's early days. Ironically, its darkness is exactly what makes it iconic today. The Skeleton Dance is now celebrated as a pioneering work that pushed animation into expressive territory no one had imagined in the 1920s. Modern critics praise its boldness, its energetic choreography, and the way it blends humor with Halloween-style eeriness. What once seemed too unsettling for young viewers is now considered a visionary milestone. But its road to acceptance began with censorship, rejection, and a reminder that innovation often scares the world before it impresses it. Number 11. Snow White, the Scary Forest Sequence. 1937. Snow White may be remembered as a warm fairy tale, but one particular sequence terrified audiences so deeply that it was repeatedly edited, trimmed, or softened in television broadcasts for decades. When Snow White flees through the forest, her imagination transforms harmless trees into grasping claws, snarling faces, and nightmarish shapes. Contemporary viewers may see it as a brilliant portrayal of fear, but in 1937 it was considered shockingly intense for children. Early audience reactions were strong enough to surprise even Disney itself. Some children reportedly cried in theaters. Others buried their faces against their parents. Censors in several regions commented that the imagery bordered on horror and recommended modifications for later releases. By the 1950s and 1960s, when TV screenings became frequent, networks routinely shortened the scene or removed the most frightening frames altogether. Disney's animators had leaned into expressionism for emotional effect, using sharp lines, chaotic motion, and distorted shapes to embody pure terror. But that very artistry triggered a cultural debate about how much darkness a children's film should contain. For years, broadcasters avoided showing the original full sequence, assuming its psychological intensity would be too much for young TV audiences. Only in recent decades did the scene return in its full form. Modern audiences appreciate it as one of the earliest examples of emotionally driven animation, a moment where visual style reflects inner turmoil. What was once deemed too dark, too frightening, too overwhelming, is now praised for its creativity. Yet for half a century, this sequence stood as proof that even the world's most beloved animated film could be haunted by censors. Number 10. Bambi, the Forest Fire, and Death Scenes, 1942. Bambi remains one of the most emotionally devastating animated films ever produced, and its darkest moments triggered objections and bans in several regions. The death of Bambi's mother, rendered off-screen but with chilling clarity, struck audiences so hard that some countries limited the film's distribution entirely. Others requested edits that softened the emotional blow, believing the trauma was too intense for young viewers. The controversy did not end there. The forest fire sequence, an apocalyptic inferno driven by roaring flames and fleeing animals, pushed animation into terrifyingly realistic territory. Every frame feels chaotic. Trees collapse, embers rain down, wildlife stampedes in desperation. For some viewers, this sequence was more frightening than anything found in live-action films of the era. In the 1940s, censors in multiple countries argued that these scenes evoked war, loss, and disaster at a time when global conflict was all too real. Others believed that the depiction of parental death crossed an emotional line inappropriate for children. As a result, several international cuts circulated with shorter fire sequences or reduced sound effects, while some regions postponed release entirely. Despite the early backlash, Bambi became a cultural touchstone precisely because of its darkness. Psychologists cite it as one of the first major films to confront young audiences with themes of grief, survival, and environmental destruction. Animators praise its realism and emotional weight, yet its legacy is inseparable from the fears it once provoked. What made Bambi immortal also made it one of the most censored classic cartoons in history. Number 9. Tom and Jerry, The Two Mouseketeers, 1952. Tom and Jerry were beloved for their slapstick chaos, but The Two Mouseketeers delivered an ending so grim that it shocked audiences and eventually led certain broadcasters to remove or heavily edit the cartoon. The short is set in a lavish French palace where Jerry and Little Nibbles raid a royal banquet while Tom struggles to guard the feast. Everything begins with typical Tom and Jerry energy, frantic chases, clever tricks, and comedic destruction. Yet beneath the laughter, this entry hides one of the darkest conclusions in the duo's entire filmography. As the short approaches its finale, Tom faces the consequences of failing his mission. The king's punishment is implied rather than shown directly, but the meaning is unmistakable. Tom is sentenced to execution for letting the mice steal the banquet. The final shot shows Jerry and Nibbles toasting joyfully while a guillotine blade drops in the distance. The sound, the implication, and the sudden shift from comedy to tragedy stunned viewers. In the 1950s, some audiences viewed this as part of the cartoon's daring humor. But when television networks began airing Tom and Jerry for younger viewers, the ending became a problem. Broadcasters feared that the execution reference, even implied, was too severe for children. Many TV edits faded out before the guillotine moment. Some stations refused to air the short entirely, claiming it strayed too far into morbid territory. Over time, The Two Mouseketeers gained a strange reputation as both a fan favorite and a banned oddity. Its boldness eventually made it memorable, but its ending remains one of the most controversial moments in the entire Tom and Jerry franchise. A simple comedy short transformed into a lesson about how quickly innocent chaos can turn unexpectedly dark. Number 8. Betty Boop, Minnie the Moocher, 1932. Betty Boop was once the queen of surreal animation, and Minnie the Moocher stands as one of her most iconic yet heavily restricted cartoons. Released in 1932, the short blended jazzy energy with dreamlike terror, creating a tone that was both captivating and nightmarish. It opens with Betty running away from home, seeking freedom, excitement, and escape. What she finds instead is a hallucination-filled journey into the bizarre. The central sequence features ghostly creatures, floating skulls, and eerie transformations, all synchronized to the haunting vocals of Cab Calloway. The animators used rotoscoping to mimic Calloway's movements, giving the creatures an uncanny, lifelike quality that made them both mesmerizing and disturbing. In an era when animation was still developing an identity, this type of surreal darkness felt revolutionary, yet the very elements that made the cartoon groundbreaking also made it controversial. Parent groups complained about the frightening imagery. Some theater owners received letters from parents who claimed their children had nightmares after watching it. Certain regional boards deemed the visuals too macabre for general audiences. As a result, Minnie the Moocher faced bans and restrictions in multiple areas, especially where strict moral guidelines governed entertainment. Over the years, the cartoon's reputation grew. What once frightened audiences is now praised as one of the earliest animation masterpieces for its creative ambition. Modern critics view it as a bold experiment that pushed animation into emotional and psychological territory rarely explored in the early 1930s. But its legacy remains tied to its censorship history. Before it became a cult classic, it was a cartoon that censors feared for being simply too dark. Number 7. Popeye the Sailor, the Paneless Window Washer, 1937. Popeye cartoons were known for chaotic brawls and wild physical humor, but the panelless window washer crossed a line that later broadcasters found deeply concerning. Released in 1937, the short initially appears to follow a typical Popeye setup, a comedic rivalry between Popeye and Bluto as they compete for the same window-washing job. Their antics escalate through slapstick pranks, broken glass, and rooftop mishaps. It is familiar territory until one particular gag shifts the tone dramatically. In the middle of the short, Popeye, frustrated by an impossible situation, makes a gesture that strongly implies despair and hopelessness. While the moment was originally intended as exaggerated, over-the-top humor, changing cultural attitudes transformed it into something far more alarming. By the 1960s and 1970s, TV networks reviewing older cartoons decided the scene presented a harmful message, even if it was brief and comedic in intention. Because of this, the panelless window washer became one of the few Popeye cartoons to face widespread edits. Some versions removed the offending gag entirely. Others avoided airing the short altogether. Broadcasters worried that children might imitate or misunderstand the dramatic gesture, turning a slapstick exaggeration into something dangerous. Animation historians now view the cartoon as an example of how comedy evolves with time. What audiences laughed at in the 1930s could be interpreted very differently decades later. Although the short eventually resurfaced in restored collections, its reputation remains overshadowed by the controversy. The panelless window washer stands as a reminder that even the most light-hearted cartoons can stumble into unexpectedly dark territory, sparking censorship and debate long after their creators are gone. Number 6. Pinocchio, Pleasure Island Transformation, 1940. Pinocchio is remembered as a gentle moral tale, but its Pleasure Island sequence remains one of the most terrifying moments in classic animation. What begins as a carnival of temptation quickly twists into a nightmare. The boys who arrive on the island believe they have escaped responsibility. They smash windows, they gamble, they shout with reckless joy. Pinocchio, swept along by the chaos, believes he has found a place where misbehavior has no consequences. But then the horror begins. As the boys continue their destructive spree, their laughter turns to panic. Their bodies begin to distort. Their hands warp into hooves. Their voices dissolve into panicked braying. The transformation into donkeys is not just frightening. It is body horror presented through the innocence of animation. Disney's animators pushed emotional intensity to the limit, capturing fear, regret, and helplessness in a way that shocked audiences in the 1940s. Censors in multiple countries argued that the sequence was too disturbing for children. Some demanded that the most graphic moments be trimmed. Others restricted the film altogether. Television broadcasts for decades often softened the sound effects or removed certain transformation shots, believing that the psychological intensity crossed a line inappropriate for family viewing. Behind the scenes, animators later admitted they were surprised by how far they were allowed to go. Their goal was to show the consequences of bad choices, but the scene became far darker than anyone expected. The blend of shadows, distorted expressions, and desperate cries created a moment that felt more like a horror film than a children's fantasy. Today, the Pleasure Island sequence is praised for its emotional power and technical brilliance, yet its legacy remains marked by the fear it once inspired. Before it was celebrated, it was a scene many networks refused to show in full. Number 5. Fantasia Night on Bald Mountain, 1940. Fantasia aimed to bring classical music to life through pure imagination, but Night on Bald Mountain became one of the most controversial segments in animation history. Set to the thunderous score by Modest Mussorgsky, the sequence unleashes a towering demon-like figure who raises spirits, shadows, and ghostly creatures from the depths of darkness. For many viewers, especially in the 1940s, this imagery crossed the boundary between artistic expression and something far more frightening. The central figure, often compared to a monstrous overlord, looms over the mountain, lifting his wings as waves of restless spirits swirl beneath him. The imagery is bold, unrestrained, and unapologetically sinister. In a time when animation was largely viewed as children's entertainment, this level of intensity shocked audiences. Some theaters reported parents leaving mid-screening. Others received complaints that the sequence was unsuitable for young viewers. Internationally, the censorship response was even stronger. Several countries cut the entire sequence during the film's initial release. Others allowed it, but demanded edits to reduce the darkness of the imagery. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, many television versions shortened the sequence drastically, removing some of the most visually powerful moments. Behind the scenes, the animators saw Night on Bald Mountain as an opportunity to explore the extremes of light and shadow. They studied expressionist films and Gothic artwork to craft an atmosphere unlike anything Disney had attempted before. Their ambition created a masterpiece, but it also created controversy. What was intended as a bold artistic experiment became one of the most censored animated sequences ever produced by a major studio. Today, the segment is celebrated for its emotional depth and technical innovation. Yet it still carries the legacy of being a cartoon that some believed was simply too dark for children. Number 4. Daffy Duck, the Wise, Quacking Duck, 1943. The Wise Quacking Duck is often remembered for its chaotic humor, but beneath the laughter lies a tone far darker than most Looney Tunes shorts. Released in 1943, the cartoon features Daffy tormenting a meek farmer named Mr. Meek. What begins as slapstick mischief quickly spirals into a psychological battle filled with intimidation, destruction, and increasingly violent gags. The comedic veneer masks a level of menace that many later viewers found surprising. During wartime, audiences were accustomed to exaggerated humor, but this cartoon pushed boundaries with its relentless sense of looming danger. Daffy becomes almost unstoppable, smashing property, threatening the farmer, and behaving with a maniacal intensity rarely seen in his other appearances. The short walks a narrow line between comedy and cruelty. For some viewers, it crossed it. When television networks revisited classic cartoons decades later, The Wise Quacking Duck stood out as one of the entries considered too intense. Certain scenes involving sharp tools and aggressive threats were trimmed or removed entirely. Some channels avoided airing the short altogether, believing its tone was inappropriate for younger audiences. Its menacing atmosphere clashed with the lighter image Looney Tunes wanted to maintain in later decades. Behind the scenes, animators intended the cartoon as a wild, energetic showcase of Daffy's chaotic personality. They experimented with timing, perspective, and physical exaggeration, but the result was darker than expected. Critics later described it as one of Daffy's most unhinged performances. Over time, its reputation shifted. Animation historians now view it as an important example of wartime cartoon experimentation, but the censorship it faced remains central to its legacy. For many broadcasters, it was a cartoon that went too far into psychological intimidation, making it one of the most heavily scrutinized Daffy Duck shorts in history. Number 3. DuckTales, The Shadow War Episodes, 1989. DuckTales was known for adventure, humor, and family-friendly fantasy. But by the late 1980s, the series took a darker turn with episodes that leaned heavily into supernatural terror. Among these, the Shadow War-themed stories stood out as some of the most intense material ever aired in a children's cartoon at the time. These episodes introduced shadow creatures that stalked characters, eerie dimension shifts, and sequences where familiar environments transformed into nightmare versions of themselves. For a show marketed primarily to younger viewers, this was a bold and unexpected move. Early audience reactions were a mix of fascination and fear. Some children loved the gothic, high-stakes storytelling, Others found the imagery too frightening, especially scenes where characters were pulled into shadow portals, chased by clawed silhouettes, or confronted by villain figures with ominous powers. Complaints reached broadcasters in several regions, and concerns grew that the episodes ventured too far into horror territory. As a result, many networks outside the United States edited the most intense moments or pulled the episodes from rotation entirely. European broadcasters were particularly cautious, removing sequences involving shadow possession or scenes where the atmosphere dipped into psychological darkness. For years, these episodes circulated in fragmented form, with some regions unaware that they had been altered at all. Behind the scenes, writers and animators later revealed that they wanted to challenge the boundaries of adventure animation by giving children a story that felt genuinely threatening. Their creative ambition succeeded, but also created controversy. Modern fans now celebrate these episodes as early examples of animated storytelling that trusted young audiences to handle layered emotion and suspense. Yet their status as too dark for TV remains an unforgettable part of their history. Number 2. The Real Ghostbusters. The Boogeyman Episodes, 1986 and 1987. The Real Ghostbusters often mixed humor with paranormal tension, but its Boogeyman episodes went far beyond what most children's cartoons dared to attempt. These stories introduced a villain who embodied fear itself, appearing with exaggerated features, unsettling movement, and a personality that felt genuinely threatening. Unlike the comedic ghosts found in other episodes, the Boogeyman was a nightmare designed to terrify younger viewers. The episodes center on children being hunted from within their own bedrooms. Closets open by themselves. Shadows move before characters do. The Boogeyman's presence creates a sense of dread that lingers even during lighter moments. When the episodes first aired, broadcasters received an unusually high number of parental complaints. Some argued that the creature's design was too monstrous. Others believed the narrative ventured too deeply into psychological fear. By the late 80s and early 90s, several networks in Europe restricted or fully banned the episodes. Some countries delayed their airings. Others demanded edits that removed the scariest scenes, including close-ups of the Boogeyman, or moments where children appeared visibly traumatized. In certain places, the episodes did not reappear until the show entered DVD restoration decades later. Behind the scenes, the writers admitted they wanted to explore fear from a child's perspective, pushing the series into darker emotional territory. Their ambition resulted in some of the most memorable episodes ever produced for the show, but also some of the most heavily censored. Today, fans praise these entries for their craft, tension, and narrative courage, but they remain forever linked to the question of how far children's animation is allowed to go. Number 1. Courage the Cowardly Dog. The Mask, 2002. Courage the Cowardly Dog frequently flirted with psychological horror, but The Mask is widely regarded as the show's darkest and most controversial episode. Airing in 2002, it delivered a story that felt more like a surreal drama than a children's cartoon. The episode follows a mysterious figure wearing a stark white mask who arrives at Courage's home, bringing tension, fear, and emotional heaviness unlike anything previously seen in the series. From its first moments, the mask creates a haunting atmosphere. The masked stranger speaks with a cold, distant tone. She treats Courage with cruelty. She stalks through rooms with silent, eerie determination. The episode deals with themes of mistrust, danger, and emotional trauma, conveyed through symbolic imagery and bleak storytelling. For many viewers, it was overwhelming. When the episode aired internationally, some networks refused to broadcast it. Others aired only edited versions that removed key scenes involving implied violence or moments considered too emotionally distressing. Several broadcasters placed it on restricted schedules, allowing it only in late-night blocks rather than daytime children's programming. For years, fans outside the United States knew the episode only through rumors and incomplete versions. Behind the scenes, the creators intended The Mask to explore fear through metaphor, focusing on emotional storytelling rather than graphic content. Their approach resulted in a masterpiece of animation atmosphere, but also one of the most divisive episodes in the entire series. Today, it is praised for its depth and bravery, yet still remembered as a cartoon many believed was too dark for young audiences. These 12 cartoons prove that animation has always carried shadows beneath its bright colors. Some frightened audiences, some challenged censors, some vanished for decades. Yet each one reminds us that darkness is part of storytelling history. If you want a new banned list or a new script version, just say the word.